Hello everyone, welcome to the arcade. Welcome to part 6, Assembly. Welcome back everyone. So now we're going to start assembly. So originally when I started doing these videos, it was cold and in the winter, and I haven't been very productive recently. So this is over the last couple of weeks, months. So just before we get started, assembly we're going to be doing in the game room, and just want to make sure that the coin door fits as it's supposed to with it. Occasionally you wind up with your coin doors have slightly different radiuses than what you want in the corners, which then causes problems for you. So this one looks good. So the only thing worse than applying full side art is applying side art to the front of the cabinet by the coin door. So in this case, I'm actually going to be applying the side art before I get started. And my preferred method for doing this is using the wet method. I've always had problems installing art to the front of the cabinets. In general, when you have a tight space to work with, it seems like you can never get it quite aligned correctly. In this case, what happens is if I install the side art or the front art to the cabinet for the Zookeeper, I can then easily tuck over the edges and do that before assembly to get a nice clean assembly edge and not have to worry about trimming it perfectly for the cabinet. Well, I've installed some side art before. I'm by far a master from doing this. There's some great YouTube videos out there. The one that comes to mind is from This Old Game from about 10 years ago, where he installed side art on a food fight cabinet. There's a couple of different ways of doing this, whether it's the dry method or the wet method, and then also some people wind up making their own water soap solutions as well for application. My best experience has been with the Rapid Tack, as I showed earlier in the video, and just taking my time. So I'll step through how I'm doing this here. Before I get too far into the install, I also wanted to thank Phoenix Arcade for the art. I purchased this actually probably a couple of years ago. They're one of my go-to places with it. I think they have some of the best art that's out there. They always have wonderful screen printing, and it's always of the highest quality. So thank you. So as I speed up this video to try and make this a watchable process, a couple things to note, and obviously the timeline isn't going to match totally with the narration. First off, whatever material you're working with, if you're going to be using your wet method, you're going to want to be cleaning it beforehand. Especially with the Rapid Tack that I'm using here, you don't want to use Windex or something along those lines to clean it. The contents of the Windex will interfere with how the Rapid Tack works, so just use the Rapid Tack. It is a little bit expensive, but I feel like I'd rather go through a little bit extra Rapid Tack and have good application than ruin my side art, which is many, many times more expensive than the supplies I use to install it. Just a quick note here, you should also be applying Rapid Tack to the back side that you're peeling off and allow it to soak through first, so I'm not doing this correct here. I guess I was overly impatient this night. You saw me put the wood insert where the coin door goes back onto the table for assembly with it. The reason for this is that when you're applying the side art, it'll tend to sag or sometimes bubble or not lay down correctly when there's a giant void in the art. So I find that application for me works out much better if I put the wood piece back in, apply the art, and then I cut it out afterwards. As I apply the side art, you're seeing that I'm doing it in sections. I've also applied the Rapid Tack to the surface as well. And basically you just wind up squeegeeing out the liquid from the center out. It is important to put the Rapid Tack on the top and also not to press too hard, or in this case I wrapped the squeegee with a paper towel. The reason for this is that you can damage the screen printing as you're applying it. So please be careful, don't press too hard, don't damage your expensive side art. With the bottom now attached, it basically will hold the art in place for you. So what you wind up doing is move the clamps down. Once the clamps are moved down, peel back and rinse and repeat the same process with it. And as I said before earlier, I wind up leaving the wood insert for the coin door in place, and I do this so that I don't wind up getting any sag as I'm applying the side art. Continue to use the Rapid Tack liberally. It seems like you can never use too much. I also tend to do this in sections. It makes everything a little bit more manageable. So you wind up applying a piece at a time. You can squeegee it out as you go. And then you can wind up moving your clamps and get ready for the last section with it. This is a much bigger deal for when you're applying it on the full sides of the cabinet as opposed to the front. You can probably get away with just a 50-50 split here. But like I said, take your time. It works out better. And in this case, I'm going to be doing it in thirds as well. And now it's just a matter of finishing up the process with it. The nice thing about the Rapid Tack is that it doesn't really set up super quick, so you have some time position, and if you do make a mistake, it peels right off wonderfully with it. The secret to this stuff is that once you get it set, you want to try and get as much of the liquid out from underneath of it as possible. If there is a little tiny bit here and there, it's not the end of the world. If you have good air release vinyl, it seems like the Rapid Tack just kind of magically disappears as you let it dry. But as you apply it. So now that I've had an overnight to let this thing dry, it's time to start trimming up the side art. Usually what I wind up doing is cutting off the big pieces first, as I did on the bottom. And then after that, I basically just fold the edges over and wind up trimming with an X-Acto knife. I would always recommend that you start out with a new blade. Blades are cheap, and it just comes out much better. With the dados on the side, like you're seeing here with it, I fold it over, but I'm cutting it off before it actually reaches the dado. And that's because we'll be using some glue later for assembly, and I want to make sure the glue is bonding to the wood and not bonding to the side art. Well, it's finally time to start some assembly. The nice thing about these Tato cabinets, with them being the dado constructions, is that they do assemble very nicely together, and they kind of hold themselves almost in place for you. So it really makes it easy, especially once you already have your blocking in place like I do in this situation. If you look at the groove that the front panel is going to be going into, we cut that slightly deeper than what the actual slot is on the side of the front panel. And the reason for this is you want to leave a little bit of space for the glue, and it also allows things to sit flush. So the outer lip essentially sits flush on the melamine, and you wind up with a nice 90-degree angle with it. So you're not fighting too much with the angles and things getting all cockeyed as you're assembling. You should also note that I used Ru glue for assembly. Ru glue is specifically made for assembly for melamine. What you find is like the Titebond 2 doesn't stick as well, and you wind up having structural issues. With that said, I've built cabinets with just glue and just screws. Both are capable of holding the cabinet together just fine by themselves, but it works out better with the Ru glue. So here we'll move up for a close-up of the joint itself. You'll see how it's flush against the blocking and how the slot fits very nicely into the groove. You can actually see a little bit of a gap on the blocking at the bottom there, and that's just for the base panel. When you go up a little higher, it's actually flush. The reason I like using the Kreg screws is when the Kreg screws go in, they actually pull the, in this case, the front panel surface back flush against the blocking. And so this helps you get your 90-degree angle, and it also helps you get that nice tight fit. Whenever you're doing any assembly on here with it, you'll note that the widest part of the panels that you're assembling is always towards the back, and they're always facing out like we did on the front here. So if you're ever curious about how whether the slot side goes closer towards the outer edge or closer towards the front edge, it's always towards the inside of the cabinet with it. Basically, you're making it so the cabinet has the maximum amount of space possible. Next up is attaching the bottom to the cabinet. This is fairly straightforward with it. A little bit of glue, and your screws will help hold everything in on your blocking side. For those of you who are cutting this by hand, the base, this is extremely important that you get this perfectly square. The reason for that is that this is pretty much what is going to align your side panels and your front and your back. And so if your base is slightly off, you're going to wind up basically kinking the entire cabinet. You get more of a parallelogram as opposed to an actual rectangular box like what you want. In my case, I'm a huge fan of clamping, so I try and clamp everything as much as I can. It just kind of simplifies the whole process. Please note that I wound up using the paper towels as a protection against the side art. If you wind up clamping it too tightly, you can actually damage the side art. All right, we'll slow down the video here, but the things to note is that you should have already dry fit everything together to make sure it fits nicely. And once you get your glue involved, it's pretty much the point of no return, especially with the melamine. So you want to be looking at the top and the bottom and making sure that you get that nice clean edge that lines up. So you'll see that the base of the cabinet lines up with the extension on the front of the panel, and also you get a nice square flush end on both sides with it. Okay, so spinning the camera around, next it's time to install the Kreg screws into the blocking that I made earlier. Usually I always like to start out with the center screw, and as you'll see here, it'll push into it, but as it tightens with how the screw and the Kreg system is designed, it pulls that in nice and flush with having it slide over. When you're done, you want to make sure that your corners didn't move on you, and then you can go on and continue to tighten up the rest of your screws. So like I said, usually work from the center out, and then want to check and make sure that everything is nice and square still afterwards. Check with the T-square, make sure everything is good. This is why I left a little tiny gap in the blocking when I assembled it originally. And check the 90 degree on the bottom panel as well. Things have dried overnight and I'm installing the bottom back panel. Not exactly sure why I'm doing this on a different day. Usually I try to install all three of these at the same time and gives them more time to dry as a single unit. I like to have all of these dry and in place before I go to start assembling the panel that's in the middle and the other side panel. Also note, I did intentionally put the bottom back on backwards. The reason for this is that I'm not using the swinging door like the Taito cabinets usually have, and I want the door to be able to sit in. So if you're doing it correct, you'll have this panel spun around the other way. Next up is installing the speaker panel. As I mentioned earlier, the thickest part of the cabinet goes towards the center with it, or towards the blocking. I'm using Rue glue again, putting it in the slot we previously cut and against the blocking, and install the speaker panel. Now this panel has a good amount of play in it, so it can be adjusted forwards and back. It's important to make sure you got your adjustment right on this, because there is a groove here that you're seeing, which is where the metal retainer clip will go that holds the monitor glass and the marquee. And the monitor glass and the marquee are meant to slide out the back. So if you have the panel down too far, you're going to interfere with the ability of that to be installed later with it. Most of the time I usually start by screwing in the center screw to hold these in place. But in this case, I'm starting with the one in the back because this is the most important positioning for me for the panel. And now I just install the other remaining screws. The speaker panel is now installed with only 3 screws holding it on one side, still nice and strong. Next up is to dry fit the other side panel. This usually goes on pretty easy with those Taito cabinets because of the dado type construction on these, and literally it will just drop in place. The goal here is really to make sure that everything squares up on the base, and so we can wind up putting our screws in to tighten everything up. We haven't used any glue as of yet. As I said, it's just a dry fit, and we're really just trying to get the base lined up with the side panels to make sure everything is nice and square. As always, clamping is best. The Kreg screws, while wonderful, do tend to push out a bit before they pull in, which then may cause your horizontal or your vertical adjustment to be slightly off. So when in doubt, clamp it and you'll wind up getting better results. As I'm installing the bottom screws here, you'll note that I didn't glue the panels on the front and the back. This is just my personal way of assembling. I'm not saying it's a better way of doing it. Probably should be gluing it. But what I usually wind up doing is when I attach the front panel onto the base, I already put the screw in the bottom to hold it in place to make sure that when the glue sets up and dries, the panel is at the 90 degree perpendicular like I want for front and back with it. So I find it's a little bit easier to adjust things if I don't have things glued up, because usually I have to do a little bit of wiggling to get the outside panel to fit correctly as I'm fit testing. So now I'm applying glue to the speaker panel and then the bottom edges and the front edge with it. And when you drop the top panel back on, it should pretty much fit. These can be a little bit tight because they do tend to pinch a little bit because we do have them screwed in nice and tight already on the bottom panel, so tolerances are pretty good. But with a little bit of a shove or a nudge, usually they go right together and line up very nicely for you. And as always, clamping is a wonderful thing. All right, with the top panel now in place, get your clamps on and make sure you clean up your glue off the artwork because it'll be extremely difficult to get off later. And basically you want to have the clamps on as you let it set up for overnight. Now is also the time where you can put your screws in the bottom. So this is just a repeat of what we did on the other side. So you wind up putting your 3 screws in and tighten the cabinet up. And when we're all done, we're checking to see if it's square. Not perfect, but not too bad either. With the second side panel installed, now is the time also to lock it into the speaker panel at the top. So just putting the screws in there. You also want to clamp it and make sure that you adjust it so that it lines up nice and square. What you'll find is quite often that the tops of these cabinets may be off by 1/4 of an inch or so when you go and set them in, like here. And so when you do this, what you want to do is make sure that you're aligning the top and the bottom so that they match. Clamp them in place, as we've been doing before. And then once that's done, you're now ready to put your screws in. Once the screws are locked in place, now it's time to step away, let everything dry overnight before you start worrying about the top panel on the top back. Next, moving on to the base. I lost some of the video files, so unfortunately we're going to have still pictures. The pieces for the base were previously cut on the CNC. I basically just screw them together externally using a 90-degree jig to make sure they stay square to each other. I also do Kreg screws, which will help for assembly later as well. Also, adding a quick coat of paint is easy to do at this time. Now it's just a matter of attaching it to the bottom of the cabinet. I use the Kreg screws to do that. I also prefer to use actual full-length 2x4s inside the base. This makes things a lot stronger. With 2 of them stacked high, you wind up getting just about the perfect height. So when you put your feet on the bottom of the cabinet, they can still recess down to the point where they're barely touching as the cabinet sits flat. Next up is installing the top of the cabinet with it. This piece requires a bunch of additional cutting as well. The piece really slides in easily from the back, and basically you push it up forward until you got square and even on both sides, as you see here in the picture. Once you have it in position, I now go back to the back of the cabinet and mark the parts that I'm going to have to trim off. I need to account for the angle and how much material. The easiest way for me to do this is I just literally color it in with a Sharpie, and then I can line it up to my table saw. Using the table saw, set the blade height and pitch correctly. I also wind up taping the panel as well to help minimize on the chipping. Unfortunately, chipping is going to occur. This is part of the reason why I was using the black spray paint earlier, because it's easier to mask the chipping and all the color will match as well. So these parts I missed while I was cutting with it, but you need to cut a T-molding slot in the front of the panel before you assemble. You're also going to want to cut a groove for the marquee to sit in on the bottom side of the panel as well. These are all marked in the CNC plans. Now that everything is cut and you got a little bit of spray paint on the back, you can dry fit it, and then it's time to assemble. Basically, you slide the panel in from the back, use some glue, and make sure you line up correctly in the back so that's nice and flush. Also, time to install your screws on the bottom side now that the top is glued in as well. Make sure you clamp it if you need to keep it nice and tight. And if everything lines up correctly, the back top should also line up nicely and fit nice and snug in the cabinet as well. At this point in time, the wood portions of the cabinet are basically assembled, and now you can actually move on to the fun part of actually assembling the game. Thank you everyone for watching.